This is the Miller Philosopher. This video was a request from a commenter on one of my other videos who said, quote, "Given that context and your clear level of knowledge, I know why you haven't addressed this, but wish you would. Rings of Power and the DEI debate. My take is that they could have done it well, but chose to be lazy, i.e., they could have had a whole completely different culture of black dwarves. The Blacklocks would have been cool to do. And elves, Umayyad or not, could have had diversity in the Second Age, and obviously the races of men. But how is Rings of Power doing it wrong, and how could it be done right in the future? Because I hope that the Legendarium will recover from Amazon's mediocrity and continue to expand with other minds and hands. I'd be interested in your take, or did I miss it somewhere?" Unquote. So first off, thank you to the commenter for the recommendation for doing this, because quite honestly, I wasn't really going to do one as a direct focus for a video. I made brief mentions of this topic here and there, but nothing directly or as a focus of a main video, and this is because I already know how many Lord of the Rings fans feel about this. One half hates Rings of Power and considers it sacrilegious to Tolkien's works. The other has no issue with it, or has no allegiance to a long-dead author as long as they're watching something that is entertaining. And moreover, there's already a plethora of other YouTubers who have commented on this before and continue to do so. And this is also a second reason why I haven't done a main video on this. I.e., I hate clickbaiting and doing videos for just likes and clicks. All that being said though, since this was a request of me, I felt I should get my thoughts on it. Though I wanted to wait till season 2 was over before I did so, just in case. I have already said how season 2 did an excellent job, I think, with the portrayal of Sauron after they got past the flashback shit. That said, I feel the answer to this question is a 4-layered issue, in my opinion, despite those who would just say that it's simply just wokeness or money. When something is taken personally, it's always easier to distill it to its most simplest terms rather than address the other factors that tend to make it more nuanced. A big part of what I see where Rings of Power conflicts with many fans is that this isn't the 2000s or even the late 90s anymore when the original trilogy was made. I mention this because more than the books, I think, this is what Rings of Power is frequently compared to. Never mind the lack of social media back then, there were real-world issues at large in Hollywood that were legit problems. Non-white actors looking for work and not getting it because Brad Pitt or Tom Cruise looked better for the part and put more butts in seats, and was just more popular. Women characters, more often than not, fulfilling secondary roles of the love interest or supporting the main male character, and child actors being taken advantage of by predatory behavior that was rampant in Hollywood for a long time. There are other examples as well, but you get the idea. This wasn't happening in Lord of the Rings, mind you, but it was happening in the industry. And since the 2010s, many people who have enjoyed the trilogy as kids are more educated these days as to the realities that exist and feel a responsibility to combat it. This, in and of itself, isn't a bad thing, and I need to emphasize that. After all, the Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings is all about combating evil. However, when the trilogy came out, these issues were also kept on the down low. Now, fast forward to the 2020s, and we, the audience, all but expect some shady shit going down behind the scenes now, whether it's wokeness or anti-wokeness. And like I said, many feel the need to not remain silent. Issue number 2, sleeper hit. When the Lord of the Rings trilogy came out, people knew about Tolkien as an author, but he wasn't, I think, a popular household name. No one ever heard of the Silmarillion or the Unfinished Tales unless you were truly a hardcore Tolkien fan, ride or die. So therefore, it could easily slip under the radar of what many people called back then politically correct alarms. Remember, this was before Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon. both only becoming big thank you to Lord of the Rings. Fantasy, or as better known sword and sandals genre, was not a huge franchise investment, so producers and studios didn't really sweat whether or not they had a non-white elf in there or a woman cutting down olifants. It didn't really matter as long as it turned in a decent profit. Nor did they care about how accurate it was to the lore of the books or not. And the fact that the PJ movies were accurate at all, as much as they were, though not 100%, speaks to the care that Peter Jackson and his crew and cast put into the project. Essentially, that the Lord of the Rings trilogy was an indie project, and no one cared about indie projects back then unless you were a college student, basically. And you see these changes in perception after the trilogy made waves. Never mind all the Pretenders and Game of Thrones that came out after the original trilogy was done. The Hobbit trilogy best displays this change. Now, mind you, I like the Hobbit trilogy. I am not shitting on that whatsoever. Having said that, now the studios had flesh in the game though. There was money to be made, and they began interfering more and more to make sure Peter Jackson put in all the standard tropes that execs had come to expect of a Hollywood hit. Romance and more sequels, basically. Hell, PJ wasn't even supposed to head the project, and had to because the original director who was going to do it backed out after long legal issues with money with Tolkien House and the studios. And this affects DEI as well, because now that everyone knows that the fantasy genre was a goldmine, the franchise was now square in the sights of DEI and social justice activists, trying to ensure that underrepresented actors got opportunities that was long denied them. Their loyalty was to the actors and the cause, not to Tolkien. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because, again, the long track record Hollywood has of fucking people over. So, come the 2020s, when Rings of Power is purchased by Amazon and announced, you better damn well know that there was going to be more alterations made than PJ and Weta ever did. Issue number 3, the fans. Many fans who either detest Rings of Power or have issues with it tend to often forget, I think, that the same arguments were brought up with the Lord of the Rings trilogy as well. Hard to believe, I know. But if the franchise was a religion, then Tolkien would be God. No offense to Tolkien, by the way. And the books would be the Quran. And yes, I know exactly what I said. And the PJ adaptions would be the Hadiths. Google that with Islam if you want to know what that is. I had said in an earlier video that any future project remotely connected with Tolkien was going to fall into the shadow of the original trilogy because it was such a massive hit and groundbreaking. And it put fantasy genres on the map now for Hollywood, making Tolkien prometheusly the king of fantasy. And yes, he was before, but only to fans that cared about the books, not to casual viewers. But at the time, many longtime fans ripped the trilogy for changes that Peter Jackson made, such as Erkenbrand not leading the charge at Helm's Deep instead of Eomer, who in the books was already there beforehand, or that Arwen replaced Glorfindel to have a more prominent role in the first movie. And yes, for some people that is still a sore one, by the way. One Rings of Power fan on Twitter argued that if social media had existed 25 years ago, then the original trilogy would have gone through the same shit as Rings of Power is right now. And that there's just no way to make that faction of the fans happy, no matter what the show did to improve or change things, or, if possible, prove their authenticity to Tolkien. Speaking of which, it's also worth noting that many Rings of Power fans, and both trilogy fans, haven't read and or don't care about the books or to read them. And that's because they're not watching these movies or shows to have homework to do. They watch them to escape reality and perhaps be inspired to better deal with it. That said, at the very least, the Lord of the Rings fandom as a whole is nowhere near as toxic as how Star Wars fandom has become. So that's one good thing at least. And it's also worth noting that fact is that because Tolkien's works are so great, they transcend races, genres, and cultures. There's a lot of people who love those books, and because of their background, where they're from, tend to see themselves in those stories. As the saying goes, art is in the eye of the beholder. Art is subjective, and there's nothing wrong with people wanting to see themselves in this. And I'll be honest with you, I can't tell a little black girl or Chinese girl that they can't be a dwarf or an elf because it wasn't in the book. I can't break them like that because it inspires them. You know, they want to be something more. They want to be these characters that have touched them in some way. And to be gatekeeping like that, because for me, that's just not how it's supposed to be done. That's just wrong to me. Issue number 3, the Execs. George R.R. Martin, Game of Thrones author, recently made a statement that the problem that most adaptations have is that their writers tend to think that they can do a better job than the original authors who wrote the damn books. And while I think that's true, I think the bigger enemy isn't them, but the execs. Another author, Zoran Zhao, apologies if I said that wrong, made an Instagram post defending George R.R. Martin about how House of the Dragon turned out for season 2, and one of the points that she makes is that it's not the writers who make the final decisions, but it's the executives. Quote, "How do you think Game of Thrones season 8 happened?" Unquote. And the whole issue with that is pretty much well known at this point, of how HBO wanted to extend beyond where George R.R. Martin had left off so they can make more money off it. Many outspoken directors and producers like George Lucas often criticize studios and producers for their lack of imagination, that they care nothing for the stories that they're housing. They care about the money that it brings in. That is their one ring, if you will. And, playing Morgoth's advocate, if you will, there's arguably a good reason for that too. Shows and movies cost millions to make, more than most of us ever will in a lifetime. Yes, the writers have to sell the scripts to studios, but then the studios must then sell the project to the investors to give them those millions to make the damn project. And if they get the money and then the movie or show doesn't produce as promised, someone's getting fucked. Just look at what happened to your favorite streaming shows, such as The Acolyte. I think of the silent Wizard of Oz's, if you will, that the idea of being faithful to the lore and the author's intentions is a luxury, not a necessity, which is where many fans and many directors and actors tend to fall into. And yes, you heard what I said there. Directors and actors can be fans of the lore as well. Going back to the Lord of the Rings franchise, again, before Peter Jackson, the studios couldn't give a damn what they did as long as it turned over a decent buck. And when it made much more than expected, then they took notice. Yet even then, the dollar was still the bottom line. It's the only reason I think why Amazon paid so much for the rights to do Rings of Power in the first place. Or just attaching Lord of the Rings to any project is at least going to draw eyes and attention. Even online vitriol and hate watching can achieve the opposite of what the protesters intend. I.e., look at the new Velma series, for example, and how much hate that got, and yet it still got a second season. And lastly, issue number 4. Can there be a more faithful adaptation? And what the Rings of Power do wrong? The question of can a faithful adaptation be done is a tough one. Like I said earlier, it's not the 2000s anymore. Lord of the Rings is no longer just a popular book series or indie project for little amounts of money that it's made for. It is now a multi-million-dollar name with a legacy that has become even greater than it was before. Everyone either is going to want a piece of that pie or make sure that their fork is stuck in it solidly. Some of it for arguably good reasons, and others just to be greedy. The social politics of today are not going away, though how much influence they can hold can be dented, as shown by the failure of The Acolyte. There are actors who want to do a Lord of the Rings series, and not all of them may fit what our minds project as what those characters look like or do, or even as what Tolkien described. And, unlike House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones, the author of the Legendarium has passed away a long time ago, unfortunately, and thus can't speak up for what is happening to his work. Now, many fans will claim that mantle, and legally and technically, that authority falls under the blanket of Tolkien House and a couple of studios. But like I said, in this religion, Tolkien is God, and everyone else is just a priest or a layman, basically. I think where Rings of Power screwed up is that it was trying to navigate this modern minefield of how to do a massive media project. Like I said, everyone now recognizes that Lord of the Rings is a cash cow. People love it, people are interested into it, it wins awards. And therefore, everyone wants to take part in it. Some of it for legit reasons because they really love the stories and are inspired by that, even if they may not, again, fit what those characters look like or what have you. Others just out of simple greed, because it makes money, and as far as they're concerned, their job doesn't require them to love the lore or be faithful to Tolkien. It just requires them to make the damn money, pay off the investors, and shut the fuck up, basically. I think that Rings of Power had the issue of trying to navigate this whole thing, and that it's hard to do that with so many cooks breathing down your damn neck, making sure that you're doing the right thing, because if you're not doing the right thing, you're going to pay for it. The other issue that Rings of Power was dealing with that got in the way of it becoming an excellent show was just the choice of topic that it chose. The Second Age and what happens in it takes place across thousands and thousands of years. And here they are trying to compress all those events and all those characters into just a few decades. And even then, having to compress then those few decades. Now, yes, Peter Jackson did the same thing with Fellowship of the Ring. However, that was only a few years, not whole centuries. And that this necessitated having to possibly remove certain key characters just to make the whole thing fit was going to cause a huge problem narrative-wise, at least to people who are aware of the lore. If you're just a casual fan, then you may not even notice, or for that matter, even care. But, having said that, writing-wise and flow-wise, it does present a problem. And then add on to that, you're trying to bring in elements that don't happen until thousands of years later in the next age. You're going to have issues. Having said all that, I think that there is no way that a future Lord of the Rings adaptation can be completely right in the future, as the commenter says. Because history has shown us that even very successful ones can't make everyone happy. It's just that the means to loudly voice their displeasure hadn't existed yet, but it does now, along with the conviction or greed or arrogance to do so. However, I do think that Peter Jackson and his team did lay the guidelines for any future minds and hands to go by if they're going to try their luck. First being that changes must be made for the sake of casual audiences and the people taking the financial risk as well. Yet, in doing that, always try to maintain the heart, care, and spirit of the original art. And this doesn't mean just doing callbacks here and there either. Spend time with the characters or the scenes that build up to that moment and make us connect with it. This is what Peter Jackson did in his trilogies. Next, leave your biases at the door. Peter Jackson famously says in the Lord of the Rings behind the scenes Blu-rays that the team made a conscious decision to leave any personal opinions or social issues about Tolkien's works out of the movies. And, understandably, that is much harder to do in today's society than it was 25 years ago. Social media is a bucket of crabs where all of them are trying to pull you down to their level. Everyone wants a piece of you and will claim that the reasons are justified in one way or another, and that if you dare go against them, you're going to pay for it, one way or another. To stand against that, execs, toxic fans, and social media takes a huge set of balls that would scare a Balrog. And people of that caliber and power are few and far between. And, most importantly, that the director at the very least understands the gravitas of helming a Lord of the Rings project beyond just its Hollywood and literary legacy. Actor Dominic Monaghan said that Peter Jackson said to the cast and crew when starting to do the trilogy that doing Lord of the Rings would be the greatest thing he would ever be known for, and that passion then infected everyone else who worked on it, from the writers, armorers, set designers, stunties, and nameless actors to the headline actors themselves. Everyone got infected with that passion and that loyalty to Tolkien's work and did their absolute best to bring it to life. And it was that dedication to Tolkien's story that made the original Lord of the Rings trilogy the masterpiece that it was, and a worthy second step to Tolkien's book themselves. In fact, I didn't start reading the Silmarillion until after I saw the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And I feel no shame in that at all. That was my doorway. That was my gateway. And Rings of Power might be someone else's, hopefully. Who knows? But, having said all that, those are my thoughts on the Rings of Power and the DEI debate. Again, it's a complicated issue, and like I said earlier, I'm just a layman spouting out my opinion and answering someone's questions. And if you just want someone to just basically continue to rant and shit on them, like I said, there are other YouTubers out there who will gladly do that for you. For me, I'm going to try to be balanced about it. I'm not a big fan of Rings of Power, but at the same time, I thought there were some things they at least got right, and that a lot of people don't understand, I think, just the amount of pressure that they're under to do those shows under the scrutiny of modern society. But this is the Miller Philosopher, and y'all have a good day.